Murder. The unlawful killing of another living, breathing human being. Or, as was the case on April 19, 1995, on a cool, crisp spring morning in downtown Oklahoma City, 168 living, breathing human beings. On this season of A Murderous Design, we'll study what may be the largest circumstantial evidence trial ever heard in an American courtroom, the United States of America versus Timothy James McVeigh. Based on the authentic trial transcripts and interviews with those who tried the case, we will uncover the author responsible for the formation and execution of A Murderous Design. I'm Brandon Birmingham. This is Timothy James McVeigh versus the USA. Timothy McVeigh chose Buffalo News journalist Lou Michel to tell his story. Over the course of several hours in the months leading up to McVeigh's execution, our guest sat down with Timothy McVeigh in Terre Haute, Indiana, as McVeigh was waiting execution with a tape recorder and a pad of paper on a quest to share with the world McVeigh's story, a story that jurors didn't get to hear, according to McVeigh himself. The result is an outstanding book called American Terrorist, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City Bombing, a New York Times bestseller, one that he wrote with journalist Dan Herbeck. Mr. Michel was kind enough to share his experience with me, and that's what you're going to hear in this episode. Please welcome Lou Michel to A Murderous Design.
Hello, my name is Lou Michel. I am a reporter for the Buffalo News in Western New York. It's the regional paper up here. And Timothy McVeigh, his family lived about 10 miles south of me. I live in Wilson, New York, on the shores of Lake Ontario, 5 miles from the shores, near Niagara Falls. And I started taking the long way to and from work, passing Bill McVeigh's house on the way. And in a friendly journalistic way, I befriended him. And I covered all of the local stories involving the McVeigh family. McVeigh was arrested 3 days after the bombing on April 19th, 1995. It killed 168 people. Many of you probably weren't born at that time. And more than 500 were injured. It caused billions of dollars of damage in downtown Oklahoma City. It gouged and just about destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building at 9:02 a.m., April 19th, 1995.
All right, so your job was to get the scoop once McVeigh was developed as a suspect, and oh my gosh, it's 10 miles away from your house. So how did you, out of all the reporters, sort of separate yourself?
Well, it was I never imagined that I would succeed, because the day McVeigh was arrested, there were news vans with satellite dishes, CNN, all of the major networks that were parked in front of McVeigh's house. And I actually did not stick there. I went into the neighborhood. It's a rural area, Pendleton, New York, Campbell Boulevard. And I started interviewing neighbors. And of course, there were other reporters who were going that route. I've never been a pack journalist, but I was sent out to Michigan, to Decker, Michigan, in the geographic thumb of the state where Terry Nichols was from, and James Nichols. And there were fewer journalists out there. There was still a roving group of journalists, but I was able to, find out about a little more about McVeigh after he returned from the Army and the first Gulf War in 1990, and became something of a vagabond, going to Michigan to the brothers Nichols residence, going out to Kingman, Arizona, where his other co-defendant was Michael Fortier and Lori Fortier, who are now in the witness protection program, along with Lori's parents, because of their cooperation in the federal trial against McVeigh and Nichols. So I started, after I came back, the state police were in front of Bill McVeigh's house for a couple of weeks because they thought there would be retribution. And there were police cars on the front lawn and on the back lawn in this rural area. And approximately 2 weeks after, one day I'm driving by on my way to the Buffalo News's Niagara County Bureau, and there were no cars there. So at 10 a.m. in the morning, I walked up. I parked my car at the end of the driveway, not to be intrusive, walked up the gravel driveway. I can still hear the crunch of the gravel against my shoes, knocked on the door, and Bill McVeigh came out, and he's a tall, hulking man, and he started looking at the road like, you belong out there, buddy. Yeah. And suddenly this woman, Wilma Donahue, comes driving up the driveway, runs out of her car. She's got a shock of white hair and says, Bill, you don't remember me. No, I do, Wilma. We used to count the proceeds from the Monte Carlo night at Wendellville Fire Company, Volunteer Fire Company, which is down the road. Bill was a very trustworthy man. He was a bingo captain at Good Shepherd Catholic Church, a church that his family went to for generations. He still goes there on Saturday to the 5 o'clock mass. And so Wilma says, well, I'm just here. She was gratified that Bill remembered him, says, I'm just here to tell you, Bill, you have no control over your grown children, and we're your neighbors, and we are here for you. And she just disappeared after that.
Said that right in front of you.
Right in front of me. And the question begged itself after Wilma left. I said, Bill, what do you think of that? And he said, he put his hand to his chest and he said, let me just move this down a little more. Yeah. He said, we have he said, they may be your grown children, but you still love them. So he talked about how neighbors were helping him out. It turned into an interview. And then I called my colleague, Dan Herbeck, from a payphone because I didn't have a cell phone back then.
Yeah.
And I said, Dan, I just interviewed Bill McVeigh. And Dan's sitting in the federal courthouse bureau for the Buffalo News, the U.S. courthouse in downtown Buffalo. He has 2 sons, young sons. I had 3 young kids at the time. And he said, Lou, I've just been sitting here thinking, what if one of my boys had done something like that? Yeah. I would still love them because you're their parent. And he said, hey, does this sound for a lead? Even though millions of Americans may hate Timothy McVeigh, his father, Bill, still loves him. And that put me essentially, Dan and I, on the road. We did a family history of McVeigh, tracing back the roots and how his Irish ancestors came here and helped dig the Erie Canal, which Bill was raised across the street from in another rural section of the town of Lockport, right next to the town of Pendleton. And I started mailing the stories to McVeigh in prison and writing him letters. And at one point he said, Lou, I'm never going to do a book, so don't bother asking me. Okay. But as time went on, and after I went out to the trial, covered it in Denver, Colorado. Dan covered some of it as well. I started sending him all of my stories, and I nodded at him in the courtroom.
Did he know who you were when?
Well, he asked an attorney to ask who this fellow was that was nodding at him.
He's nodding at him.
Yeah, and so then I told him I'd been writing Tim letters and such, and so McVeigh then a couple of days later nodded back at me. I was trying to establish whatever kind of relationship I could. And ultimately, after McVeigh was condemned to death, he called his father and he said, Dad, do you know of a journalist that you believe is trustworthy? And Bill McVeigh mentioned my name. And it went from there. That was after his conviction in the spring of 1998.
And what eventually became your book, right? This American Terrorist.
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe it's backwards.
That looks like it was a library version.
Hey, I have fallen in love with abooks.com. You can get Good books at A Books. So not to do an advertisement for A Books, but yeah. And that became, I guess, that became the start of what would be a number of personal one-on-one interviews over the course of the next couple of years, I suppose, until he was executed.
Yeah, I did 4, 6, 7-hour days, consecutive days of interviews at the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Dan came out with me, and he'd listen to the tapes from the day before and then come up with more questions that I'd ask the next day. And then a year later at the U.S. Penitentiary at Terre Haute, Indiana, where death row is, we did 3 other interviews, and Dan did one of those interviews, because I figure when one of us dies, there'll still be someone alive who actually did this biographical face-to-face work.
And tell me about the interview process. And I guess by that, I mean, what was your mindset going into it? What was it like the first time you actually sat down across from him and started talking to him?
Well, it was surreal, actually. We had covered the trial, and we knew where the holes were. And not to get ahead, but the government did masterfully present that case. They wove it together with human stories that the jury could connect to, and then facts, so the dry stuff, the circumstantial evidence, and then the impact of on the victims throughout. So it held your attention. And by the way, they used our book and the confessions the U.S. government did in the appeals that McVeigh had filed, because he wanted another trial. But I get ahead of myself.
Okay.
So the first day when I was there, I had to set up all of this electronic equipment, and I'm not an expert, but I became an expert for the recording, the wireless mic and stuff. And the corrections officers in Florence had to really go over the equipment and make sure it was safe. I got a scan of my eye, all of that stuff that you see in the movies.
Okay.
Went down this flight of steps where the visiting room was, in these cinder block cubicles, and with glass that is really thick, but like a donut hole when you go to a bank window, that steel donut hole, the venting. Yep. And of course, I had a headset on, and I could hear McVeigh a lot better because I didn't have to shout. And so we recorded him. But the first thing McVeigh said to me was, he looked at his watch and said, "You're late." I said, "Well, please don't blame me. It was the corrections officers." And he said, "It figures it was the government." And I established, you have to establish a personal connection. People would say, "How dare you for cuddling up to the worst domestic terrorists in American history?" However, you have to give these people something. He knew I was an Eagle Scout. My sons were in scouting. My one son loved Star Wars, and McVeigh was the USS Enterprise. What is it?
Star Trek.
Star Trek. He was a
Yes.
Trekkie.
Yeah.
And so things like that. And I said, Tim, I'm Catholic like you are, and I'm Irish, despite the last name of Michel. My mom's parents were from. And he said, "Well, that's probably why you're sitting here." I just say that, for these future law students, for an important case, and every case is arguably important. Sure. You want to have this connection. And this is why it was so important. McVeigh told me that day, "I'm going to talk to you in hypotheticals. I don't feel comfortable saying, taking credit at this point, even though there was material already out there." And I said, "That's fine." I figure if this doesn't work out, I'm going to have McVeigh's complete backstory. But I did say, "Tim, no self-respecting publisher in New York City is going to go with a book on hypotheticals." And HarperCollins eventually published the book, although the rights have reverted back to Dan and I.
Yeah.
Good thing. So the next day, I got his whole background over 6 or 7 hours that day.
Just on the first day?
On the first day.
Okay.
And the next day, the first thing McVeigh said to me at 9 a.m. was, I've been up all night and I've been thinking about what you said about, a reputable publisher. It's on you. You don't leak it. If you leak it, you're scooping yourself. But I am the Oklahoma City bombing. I committed the bombing, and here's why. And the first thing I jumped to was the daycare center. There were 19 children killed in the bombing. 15 were in the second floor daycare, America's Kids. And he said, I did not know there was a daycare center there. Why would I confuse my message by being a child killer when my enemy was the U.S. government, the FBI, federal law enforcement agencies? That's why I picked the Murrah building. And he said, and of course, I knew somebody might be walking past the building at 9 a.m, heading somewhere with their child, perhaps to a daycare, and children might be killed. But that was collateral damage because I was at war against the U.S. government. And I'm sitting there and it's 10 o'clock in the morning. He's having his lunch because it's a very monastic life in these prisons, 23 hours a day, you're in your cell. And by the way, the range he was on, you had Ted Kaczynski down a few cells down, who was the Unabomber. You had Ramzi Youssef, the first World Trade Center bomber, and Terry Nichols was later there as well. You had this gang member from Texas, Juan Garza, I think his name was, who was executed by the federal government shortly after McVeigh.
And these were all in the same block.
They in the same hall or whatever you want to call it. They call technical name is a range.
Okay.
And so I'm sitting there and I had a can of Coca-Cola from the vending machine and Famous Amos chocolate chip cookies. And I'm having like this surreal feeling go through me as he's telling me all of this stuff, giving a real mouthful. He wanted to get it off his chest. And I'm saying, is this the caffeine and the chocolate and the chocolate chip cookies? But no, it was the shock of hearing McVeigh tell all of these things.
What was his demeanor like when he was telling you these things? Can you describe it?
Well, it varied at times. He was very proud of what he had done. I later interviewed the defense psychiatrist, John Smith, who I think he was from Oklahoma City, and I got a waiver to interview him. And he best described it when McVeigh admitted to him that he was the bomber. He said it was like Tim was successfully describing a middle school science project. He was so proud of what he had done. And so McVeigh went through extreme detail with me and Dan, in these face-to-face interviews, in dozens and dozens of prison phone calls and letters. We donated a couple hundred letters from McVeigh to St. Bonaventure University, where my sons went to school and where Dan is a graduate from their School of Communications. And so McVeigh went into such detail, and he said, how could there be other co-conspirators except for Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier and Lori Fortier? And here it is. There's receipts to show where I bought. They dug up receipts from the different weed and feed stores where he bought the fertilizer, where he purchased the racing fuel that he mixed with it, and the 55-gallon drums. I mean, everything was accounted for. I won't get into pointing fingers, but other people have said he was just a quote unquote mule, and that he had to be involved with this Elohim City, which was in Oklahoma, in the, in a rural area where white supremacists were. Yes, he had contact with them. He had contact with Andrea Strassmeyer, a white supremacist from Germany who was doing the gun shows over here. He's known as Andy the German, and various things like that. But all accounted for every step of the way. Now, having said all that, was there one or two other people who may have been involved? That is entirely possible. But Dan and I do not believe that it was this widespread conspiracy, as some people have said it was, and have included the U.S. government in the conspiracy. Now, I've known federal agents and police. I come from a family of police officers all of my life, and I'm 65, and I know that they would want to get as many of the culprits as possible. They wouldn't give anyone a pass, and it would have been revealed by now if the government had a hand in that.
Let me ask you about that. There was one piece of evidence, the left leg.
Exactly. That's the primary reason that I even say, could there have been more people involved? Or when McVeigh was renting the Ryder truck up in Kansas, some guy gave him a ride. And I think it was just somebody from the base. And he may have known him from Fort Riley, because he rented the Ryder truck. I can't remember the name of the rental agency and repair garage, but he did say he got a lift. It was raining out as he was walking from the McDonald's, where there's that time-stamped video that shows him entering the McDonald's and I think leaving it, where somebody gave him a ride over to it. It'll come to me in a minute, to the rental agency.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask it this way. There's two things. Number one, the idea that that there was a conspiracy and that other people were involved, that was a bone of contention between him and his lawyer.
Absolutely. In particular, it was a bone of contention between him and Stephen Jones. And for some people, and probably many people, it's hard to believe that one person from rural Pendleton, New York, could pull something off like that. But you know what? We live in a very free society. Over in Europe, if you buy a large quantity of fertilizer, records are kept. I don't know. They were changing that. It was one of the laws that they were proposing to change in the United States after the Oklahoma City bombing, to keep records of that type of stuff. But you can go and buy 10-10-10, which has the prills in it, I believe, that was part of the bomb, at any weed and feed store. You can buy that type of fertilizer and then you mix it. It's we live in a free society.
And I get the sense, and you tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
Because I didn't, I've never spoken with him, obviously, but my other sense is I feel like he wanted that there was the consternation between the two. Number one, because it wasn't true, according to McVeigh. Number two, he was proud of what he did, that he was able to accomplish it, and to say that there was some vast conspiracy means that he couldn't have.
Right.
And talk about that a little bit. Do you agree with that?
Well, McVeigh was a very smart guy. He went to a local business college up here, and he very good in math. And so he has that gene. And Bill McVeigh, his dad, is very good in math. He can add up numbers in his head, row of numbers. He just has that gene. And McVeigh was, he qualified for special forces in the Army, and he was a top gunner in his unit. He got the Bronze Star. He killed a couple Iraqis in the first Gulf War from a shot that was very far away from his Bradley vehicle. I forget the distance. And so he loved weapons. He subscribed to the Soldiers of Fortune magazine, things like that. He had all of that schooling, if you will, and of course he was proud of what he did, but he was a gun nut, and and the soldiers that he knew in the army, testified about that, and so yeah, he felt insulted that that Stephen Jones couldn't believe it, and it is a lot to get, as I said, it's a lot to put your head around. But one man could be the quote unquote mastermind here, but he planned it out.
When he was describing this to you, in other words, the way that he's able to put together his sentences and recall the information, it seemed to me he was a pretty meticulous type person. Is that the way that he spoke and the way that he revealed?
Yeah. Like when he was describing how he used the word shaped the bomb so that the force would go a certain way. To Lori Fortier in her mobile home's kitchen, he had taken cans of Campbell's soup and showed how he made a V of it, and how he had two different fuses for redundancies and a third redundancy where he piled a lot of explosives in one corner of the truck so he would shoot it if it didn't, either of the long fuse and the short fuse hadn't gone off. And he was actually in the cubicle on his side of it. He was, he had his finger on the table there in front of him, the little ledge that came out from the window. And he was, doing all of this. And afterwards, he actually sent me a diagram of the bomb, which St. Bonaventure University has. It is in the book. And he also sent me his escape route. So he was meticulous.
Why do you think somebody is meticulous, prepared, and this was on his mind for some months at least, but why did he use his regular name, his name at the Dreamland Motel?
He wanted to get caught. He had a stack of material in that Marquise Mercury, which is on display in the Memorial Museum, the Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum. It's on display. It's quite a sight. And he had a stack of material in a brown, I believe it was a brown envelope. John Locke was in it, Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers, different people, who espoused revolution. He had that T-shirt on with the quote from Thomas Jefferson saying that the tree of liberty, and it had red droplets of blood on this tree coming down, must be nourished from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That was on one side of this T-shirt. On the other side was what John Wilkes Booth screamed after he had shot Lincoln at Ford Theater, sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants. And so he wanted to be caught. It was all his little joke, in a sense, a sick joke. He left breadcrumbs for the federal authorities on a report card that was found at his house in Pendleton. A first grade report card or something. It was blank where the teacher would write in a comment. And he wrote in, Tim wants to be a gun store owner when he grows up, something like that. Again, yanking the government's chain, different ththings like that. I believe he had a wicked case of post-traumatic stress disorder from the first Gulf War. And because he did have a nervous breakdown. And he showed up at his grandfather's house, the house where Bill was raised, adjacent to the Erie Canal, one day in February after he'd come home, been discharged. He had washed out of special forces. He resigned because he wasn't in top shape after the first Gulf War. He should have, said thank you and waited a while and, built up his stamina. But
that's what Chris Tritico said too.
Yeah. And then we wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
That's exactly what he said too.
Yeah.
You believe that?
I do believe it. And McVeigh said that as well. And so he showed up at his grandfather's house in February in Western New York, which has harsh winters. And he's in his sweatpants and socks and no shirt. And he knocks on Ed's door and he says, Grandpa. And Ed says, Tim, what's up? What's happened? I don't know, Grandpa. And Tim had a room there. And because Bill and Mickey McVeigh were divorced, and Ed became like a surrogate parent. And while Bill and Mickey, the mom, were working, Ed filled in a lot as the parent, with doing a lot of watching. From everything I know, Ed was a wonderful man. And so he had the nervous breakdown. And we're talking about his meticulous manner. Mm-hmm. But why he became unhinged to a degree. And he started, as I mentioned earlier, a vagabond, moving around the country, getting into gun shows, seeing these crazies, the lunatic fringe. There are a lot of good people who go to gun shows, but there is a lunatic fringe there with Hitler clocks, with the Sig Heil for the second hand or minute hand going up and down, Nazi flags, things like that. And McVeigh was drawn to that end of the spectrum. And so he's slightly unhinged. He's building up a case to go to war with the government. There was Ruby Ridge in 1993, Randy Weaver. His son was killed, I believe. Yep. And perhaps his wife, and a federal agent was killed as well. And then 2 years later, April 1993, Ruby Ridge was before Waco, right? A year or two before Waco. Then Waco, April 19th, 1993. And McVeigh went there a couple of times, or he went there once, and he was going back a second time, and then the siege ended with the burning of Waco. And that was the turning point for McVeigh.
He was in prison for a couple of years by the time that you're having these conversations with him, I think, right?
Yeah.
98 or so. His family noticed around this, let's call it the vagabond era, for his life, where he's traveling around to the gun shows and all that. They noticed a dramatic change. He was, every time he'd see something on TV, he'd yell and stomp.
Oh, yeah.
But how was he in 1998? I mean, was he sort of under a spell and then had gone away, or did he still talk about politics and his worldviews? He was
very comfortable. He was very comfortable with what he was. He hated the U.S. government. He could be very affable, but when he talked about the Bureau of Prisons or the federal government and its justifications, he wasn't giving that up at that point. Maybe if he had lived another 20 or 30 years, he might have been able to see the error of his ways. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, sent me a letter, and McVeigh encouraged me to write him. And I was shocked because Kaczynski actually criticized McVeigh, saying he should have blown up the Murrah building at night and maybe just killed a custodian, which says volumes about Ted Kaczynski and his value for human life. But no, McVeigh owned his story and wasn't giving it up. And I think part of that was, whether he knew it or not, was that to really know the breadth of the humanity that he had destroyed would have just killed him, I think.
Well, you would know, I think, of anybody. I think that one of the things that we study is motive and how that compels human action, usually to gratify some, a personal gain or some unlawful desire. And it seems to me that there's an element of what McVeigh wanted to do, which was to be public. We mentioned he was, kind of he wanted to be caught and all that. Do you think that he ever had his motive, his desires gratified by what he did?
Oh, I think he felt a sense of accomplishment. There's no question about that. And with the people he killed, he put it in pure military terms, collateral damage. There was a movie, I think, with Arnold Schwarzenegger. They actually delayed that movie because of the name, because collateral damage was one of the big things that came out of our book. And, people were aghast at that. And, but he wasn't going back. He was comfortable with what he did, and he saw himself as a martyr. And his motive was that the U.S. government was the biggest bully in the world. Ruby Ridge, Waco. He even cited the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy over in Yugoslavia, something when the Baltic states were at war back in the 90s. I can't remember all of the circumstances, but he had even cited that. And he even mentioned John McCain, God rest his soul, in one of the letters, saying that he's going to be the new Hitler. I've seen some of the things that he says, and he's a warmonger and this and that. And and he actually mentioned Osama bin Laden in one of the letters. And
and to put that in perspective, bin Laden, 2011 happened after he was executed. 9/11 happened after he was executed, right? Mm-hmm. He was executed in June of 2001.
3 months before 9/11.
3 months before. Yeah. So he was mentioning Osama bin Laden to you?
Yeah, with something in some. It was the attack on the USS Cole, which had happened previously.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you share with him your book before you published it? I mean, did he ever?
No, he wanted to see galleys and all of that. As diplomatically as I could, I said, Tim, I just can't do that because of journalistic integrity and independence. I ran a lot of facts past Bill McVeigh to make sure I had the family history correct. Mm-hmm. And but McVeigh had no final say-so on that book. I mean, I ran facts by him, double-checking things. One of the things that we did repeatedly was ask him if he would make an apology, going back to what you were just saying. Dan Herbeck said, that would mean an awful lot to the people of Oklahoma City, some symbol of contrition. And McVeigh did send me a letter, just a few weeks before he was executed, saying, yeah, I'm sorry that it happened, but blame the U.S. It was a half-baked apology. Blame the U.S. government. The government made me do it.
His defense was a necessity defense.
Correct.
Which would have been, I had to do what I did because things like Waco and Ruby Ridge were going to happen in the future, and I had to stop it. That's how he viewed it. Is that a fair statement?
That is fair, and you can throw the Second Amendment in there. He truly believed that the ATF was going to take away the guns of law-abiding American citizens, that the ATF was going to get diagrams of independent federally licensed gun sellers' homes, and take the guns away from them. And, part of the thing with this is Bill McVeigh had noticed a change in his son. Tim would throw stuff, a newspaper at the TV whenever he periodically would come home from his odyssey. And, when Bill Clinton was on the TV or Janice Reno, and, Tim would try to get his father, who honorably served in the Army back in the early 60s, to see his point of view. And Bill would say, Tim, I am not interested in that BS. Bill can be a very gruff guy. And, and he wasn't afraid to say that to his son. He's not the most diplomatic man in the world, but he's very sincere. And Bill wasn't interested in hearing that. So there were these other people in McVeigh's life. Terry Nichols' older brother, James Nichols, who ran the family farm in Decker, Michigan, who was a white supremacist, anti-government, against taxes. And of course, this all coincided with the fact that he was bankrupt too. And farmers did get a raw deal at some point back in the 80s. But you had James Nichols, who's deceased now. Terry Nichols is serving a life sentence in Florence at the Supermax prison. And you had this other fellow, Roger Moore, who lives down in Florida now, but was from Eureka, Arkansas. And he had this munitions company that would sell stuff at gun shows. And McVeigh would actually stay at Roger Moore's house. And Roger Moore, Tim was gullible to a point. Even though he was a bright guy and owned what he did, but he could be gullible. That father figure, I think, was what he was looking for. And Roger Moore, he would tell Roger Moore, I'm going to, go out in the desert when I go out to 40 years and do some survival runs. And Roger Moore would say, well, be sure and wear your space blanket so that the satellites won't heat detect you on the ground. Hearing a grown older man say crap like that, shame on him. And I think it's in the book. And, other things where he went out in the desert to test a micro version of his bomb with older people, one of Michael Fortier's father, I think, or father-in-law, I can't remember which at this point, that kind of gave some type of a psychological verification, support that he wasn't totally off his rocker. To have people like that. Fortier had that yellow flag, don't tread on me. It was the American flag at one point,
right,
flying in front of his house. And I'm not being critical of that flag, but it has become a symbol like the Confederate flag of, hatred toward the U.S. government in some circles.
You got to, I guess you completed all your interviews, but you were actually at his execution.
Yes, I was.
When was the last time you talked to him before that?
I talked to him a few weeks before, and I asked him for an interview the day before he'd be executed. He said, Lou, we've had a good run here. Let's just leave it at that. And but he did give me his statement, which was Invictus, the poem, walking on the razor's edge. I am the captain of my ship. And, so he was faithful to me. I didn't, I kept my word. Nobody knew the scope of what Dan Herbeck and I were working on. And of course, I wasn't going to go to the Associated Press and tell them. And it wasn't the type of thing you could do in a newspaper story, the breadth of it. We wanted this to be the book when historians look back on this tragic incident. And we believe it has been. I mean, it's based on several documentaries are based on it, and we're proud of our work, Dan and I. We're not ashamed of what we did. Yeah. And and some people there's some people in Oklahoma City, I think they've come to see us in a better light, but initially we were called accomplices to murder, and that hurt.
Let me ask you about that. You write the book. I mean, obviously it's very well researched. It does come from the source. You can't debate what he told you. It's on your tapes, but this book was not very well received. What was the backlash that you initially received, and why the backlash?
Well, as one journalist from the Tulsa World told us at the execution of McVeigh, actually, I was in the building witnessing the execution, and Dan spoke to this woman reporter from Tulsa, and she said, that was a good book you fellas wrote, but it was just too raw. for us at this time. And so that was we weren't going to sugarcoat McVeigh's words because we were writing history. And there was I could not believe the backlash. We donated 5% of our proceeds we made an arrangement to donate it to the memorial. And when the book came out, they said they wanted nothing to do with us. We have since patched up our relationship with the memorial, and they realized that we were sincere and honest journalists, not some people who were, from the far right or somewhere like that. That, Dan and I are family men, and we're men of faith as well. And I'm proud of that. And but the Oklahoma State Legislature adopted a resolution condemning the book. The mayor of Oklahoma City said I wouldn't spend a dime on that book. The governor of Oklahoma at the time, Mr. Keating, had criticized the book. John Ashcroft, who was the attorney general when the book came out, he had glancingly said that Timothy McVeigh is going to spend eternity in the deepest, darkest room in hell. And George W. Bush, the president, also had said something along the lines of the media needs to exercise restraint. Fortunately, all of the major news outlets in the country, whether they be of a liberal bent or a conservative bent, had said that Dan and I had done the public a service by that. And people in Oklahoma City also said that, who had lost people in the bombing, survivors and relatives of deceased. We had our supporters there, and I went down for the 25th anniversary and did 80 hours worth of interviews over about 7 days, and for a series of stories on the 25th anniversary this past April 19th. And people, at this point, 25 years has passed. The book is approximately almost 20 years old now. And I interviewed, probably a dozen survivors, and they actually started interviewing me. They wanted to know about McVeigh, and I was so happy to tell them and share all of my insights. And I mean, I just love that memorial. I mean, because I feel a real attachment to it. Sure. Having gone through what I went through McVeigh, I witnessed his execution. Spending all of that time with him, you just, that never leaves you. And I feel a real sense of serenity when I'm at that memorial and attachment. I wrote a column about it. After 25 years, I let my own opinion come out in a column where I actually spoke to McVeigh. Tim, did you realize you did this? Did you realize you do that? I don't know where you are now, but I hope, it's at a place of peace. I'm not sure that he went to hell. I can't. I'm not a judge. I'm not a judge. I'm not a jury. I'm a journalist who tries to get, like Stephen Jones said, there's two sides to every pancake. But, along the rim of the pancake, there's other sides. There's many sides to a story. And that's what Dan and I tried to present in our story, in our book.
Do you still think about him?
Oh, all the time. Not every day. I used to. But, I do think about him a lot. I still can't believe it actually happened. That I got this story that Gore Vidal was angling for it. I was reading letters from Gore Vidal. I think he's done he was a very famous writer. I was people from the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington, all of those papers on their fancy letterheads were sending McVeigh letters, and many more networks and such. And I would just write McVeigh on yellow legal pads in handwriting, telling, well, this is the story I did on your family today. And, I would really like to tell your story. Yeah. And, I didn't present myself as anybody other than who I am. And, I'm the oldest of 9 kids. I come from a low middle class background, low income background, and I love this country, and I wanted to do the right thing, and journalism is my life.
Well, that's magnificent. I, have really appreciated talking to you. Is there anything else that, we haven't talked about that you want to talk about or share?
I'm good. That sounds like a question a reporter asks. I like that.
Well, they're very similar, lawyers and reporters, and we're storytellers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You have to arrange it in a certain way. And I've always been fascinated with it and continue to be to this day.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I guess I do have one more question.
Okay.
What would Timothy McVeigh think about 2020? Think about these times.
He wouldn't be surprised. He wanted to instigate a revolution. He told me that he was hoping that people from the Second Amendment movement, white supremacists, they would all join together and fight to overturn the country. That at the bombing site, there would be federal agents wearing their FBI windbreakers and other types of identifying garments, and that people would be taking sniper shots at them. So
from all different groups.
Yeah. All of these groups would come. It was his dream that all of these radical groups would come together, right and left, even Black Panthers and things like that, and that they would overturn the government. And then later on down the road, they would settle their differences. And but he had really hoped to spark a revolution. And I will say that with the 9/11, with the Twin Towers, not necessarily the Pentagon, but with the Twin Towers, he would have been against that, going into those buildings, because they were the majority of the people, nearly 3,000 who lost their lives that day, were civilians. He was going after what he believed was a rogue government, the United States government.
Thus concludes our time studying the Timothy McVeigh case. I would like once again to thank all of my guests for sharing their time and talents with me and, in turn, with you. Please visit amurderousdesign.com for more information on these stories of the biggest trials ever heard in an American courtroom. Finally, if you have any suggestions for the next case study, please send it. I'd love to hear it. I'm Brandon Birmingham. This has been Timothy McVeigh versus the USA. Thank you very much for listening.